Today, we're undertaking a truly fascinating mission, a deep dive into the rhythms of the real estate market. Forget the quarterly earnings reports and the Fed minutes for just a second. We're exploring a controversial but, you know, surprisingly consistent pattern. The idea that housing booms and busts repeat on a predictable schedule, almost like a cosmic clock, is timing the action. Economists often track the approximate 18-year economic property cycle, noting this rhythm of expansion, overreach, bust, and recovery. Seems deeply entrenched in modern capitalism. But what if that economic cycle is simply reflecting deeper, more fundamental natural patterns? Our mission today is to unpack how this 18-year rhythm seems to be synchronized with two ancient cosmic cycles, leading to turning points that are often remarkably precise. Okay, let's unpack this.
It's compelling, right? Because the economic cycle, which, yeah, is driven by credit expansion, land speculation, and that slow infrastructure investment, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It really appears to be marked by these two overlapping celestial clocks. And when all three cycles converge, well, history suggests we get a pretty significant market event. So we're dealing with three converging rhythms that often seem to synchronize to mark major turning points. First, you've got the foundational 18-year economic property cycle. Second, the 18.6-year lunar node cycle, which is traditionally associated with, let's call it, collective karmic rebalancing, or maybe the time of the harvest. And third, the 20-year Jupiter-Saturn cycle. This one sets the sort of structural backdrop for institutional confidence and collective expansion or contraction.
That 20-year Jupiter-Saturn cycle seems like the place we have to start. It governs the rise and fall of collective confidence, institutional structures. We're talking about these massive long-wave economic shifts. How does this cycle's internal structure, the geometry of the sky, if you will, how does that translate into predictable market phases down here on Earth?
Well, what's fascinating here is the structural pattern within that 20-year span. It's almost like a new moon to full moon sequence playing out. The cycle kicks off with the conjunction. That's where Jupiter, representing expansion, and Saturn, structure or limitation, meet up. It starts a new phase of collective ambition, growth, that sort of thing. Then, about 5 years in, you hit the waxing square. Think of this as the first major friction point. It's where that optimistic vision set at the conjunction hits a serious challenge, maybe its first big test. Institutionally, this is often the moment you see speculative peaks. People get overconfident, right? Assume endless growth, and the structural integrity starts to strain.
So the waxing square is that moment when the market sort of decides its initial optimism wasn't optimistic enough, and maybe the smart money starts getting a bit worried.
Precisely. Yeah, it's when speculation can morph into, well, delusion. And finally, 10 years in, you reach the opposition. This is the cycle's full moon moment, peak visibility. And it usually aligns with a major moment of reckoning, the painful reality check, often the bubble bursting.
Okay, let's apply this. The last major housing event, the 2000s bubble, that cycle started with the conjunction in the year 2000, right?
That's right. The conjunction happened in Taurus. Now, Taurus is the earth sign associated with material wealth, tangible assets, fixed values, stuff you can touch. So that alignment really set the tone for a decade of intense focus on accumulating real assets, land, housing. It was the birth of that belief that houses weren't just homes, they were ATMs.
Okay, so if that was the growth phase kicking off, then the speculative peak should hit around the waxing square. And sure enough, 2006 marks the absolute peak of the frenzy.
Yeah, I remember that time vividly. It wasn't just speculation. It was that, cocktail party moment where everyone you knew seemed to have bought a second or third property. They were convinced prices would just never fall. That must be what the waxing square felt like on the ground, that friction between, endless expansion and the actual structural reality. It was pure overreach, absolutely. And critically, institutional structures, particularly lending standards, were totally compromised during that period. The initial growth vision from 2000 had become, frankly, grotesquely inflated by 2006. The economic system just couldn't sustain that tension. Then the opposition arrived in 2010, hitting that halfway mark. That was the full reckoning, when housing markets were really scraping bottom and the systematic failures of the last decade became tragically visible for everyone to see.
Wait a minute, though. Isn't there a risk here of confirmation bias? We're looking backward, finding patterns that fit. How robust is this correlation when you look further back? Does it hold up outside of just the U.S. housing crisis?
That's an absolute necessary question. And what's remarkable is the consistency. Look at the cycle before that one. Back in 1980, we had the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Libra. Now, Libra focuses on balance, systems, institutional relationships. 10 years later, the opposition arrived in 1990. And what happened in 1990? Well, that period brought the systemic failure of the savings and loan crisis and a very deep very painful real estate downturn across the U.S. The very institutions, the systems emphasized at the start of the cycle in Libra, they failed right at the opposition point. The structural pattern of crisis aligned almost perfectly with the structural geometry in the sky, a decade apart. It's pretty striking.
That connection between institutional cycles and market crashes is compelling, I have to admit.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's talk about the 18-year economic cycle itself. The underlying mechanics of that cycle are supposedly driven by land speculation and the slow, deliberate pace of infrastructure creation. We're told the cycle naturally resets when land price appreciation just outruns economic rents, forcing a crisis.
Exactly. The 18-year cycle is purely economic in its mechanics. But what the cosmic timing suggests is maybe the planets don't cause the economic mechanics, but they perhaps time the human reaction to them, the moment of collective panic or collective exuberance.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Let's layer in that second cosmic clock, the lunar nodes. They cycle every 18.6 years. So if Jupiter-Saturn sets the institutional stage for how we build things, the lunar nodes seem to dictate the timing of the audit-like, the point where the market is forced to review the quality of that building. The karmic rebalancing, as you called it.
Yeah, the nodes are often seen that way, signifying collective turning points, a shift in destiny maybe, or a time for reflection on past actions, or, as you put it, the audit. It's when we collectively reap what the previous cycle has sown. So if we connect this to the bigger picture of the last housing peak, the symbolic fit is, well, incredibly deep. During that 2006-2007 peak, the South Node was in Virgo.
Okay, Virgo. And what does that mean beyond just harvest?
Virgo is meticulous, right? Focused on utility, measurement, sorting things out. That's the absolute key. Virgo's symbolic lesson is about discerning utility. Separating the genuine article from the imitation, it's the sign of the auditor, the analyst, the person counting the beans, making sure things add up. So when the South Node, which represents a point of release, of reckoning, is in Virgo, the collective energy shifts towards a meticulous review of underlying values. And this symbolic pressure seemed to translate into very tangible economic pressures back then. That sudden, intense focus on the viability of lending, remember, subprime assets, the realization that measurement standards, ratings, were maybe fraudulent, and the institutional panic to separate the wheat from the chaff in their portfolios.
So the collective was essentially forced into a Virgo phase, a rigorous, painful accounting of the true utilitarian value of these inflated assets right at the peak of the inflated prices. The cosmic cue was basically time to rigorously sort out reality beneath those inflated values.
Precisely. The symbolism fits perfectly with the economic outcome. Virgo's demand for reality check led straight into the subsequent collapse, the market's autumn, if you will. Prices fell, and a long winter of correction followed. The nodes seemed to signal the timing of that collective, almost unavoidable rebalancing.
Okay, now we pivot to the present, because this is where the theoretical meets the practical. If these three cycles, the 18-year economic, the 20-year structural, and the 18.6-year karmic, are powerful individually, the fact that they seem to be aligning right now, between 2024 and 2026, suggests another major turning point might be imminent, or at least developing.
Yes, we are definitely seeing a powerful, multi-layered alignment that strongly echoes the setup of past downturns. Let's start with the Jupiter-Saturn cycle again. The last conjunction was in December 2020. And critically, that conjunction happened in Aquarius. Aquarius is an air sign tied to systems, networks, technology, collective innovation, ideals. That alignment, you could argue, fueled the massive shifts we've seen since then. The remote work revolution, the explosive rise in crypto and digital assets, and the systemic network-driven inflationary pressures.
Okay, and we are currently hitting the waxing square of that cycle right now in 2024-2025. So if the square is the tension point, what's the core conflict this time around?
The tension feels immense. It looks like structural friction between the ideals and innovations of Aquarius, our future networks, digital currency ideas, collective systems, and the very material, fixed realities of Taurus. Taurus represents tangible wealth, land, housing, the actual cost of raw materials. So it's a structural conflict between, say, the digital dream and the inflationary reality on the ground. This kind of systemic tension usually manifests as a peak in cost and difficulty, a moment of potentially overreach again.
So the high cost of housing and goods isn't just a byproduct of post-COVID supply chains, maybe, but reflect the deeper structural tension that's been building since that 2020 conjunction.
That's the hypothesis, yes. And now, layer onto that, the karmic harvester, the nodes. The South Node is returning to Virgo in 2025-2026, almost exactly one node cycle later than the last housing peak. This signals another potential harvest season. The market is, symbolically at least, being forced again to apply that Virgo lens to sort out reality from illusion. Only this time, maybe the illusion isn't just subprime lending, maybe it's the fundamental affordability and utility of housing in some of those key boom markets.
And the economic signs on the ground already seem to reflect this necessary sorting out what's real from what's inflated. It's not just talk anymore. We are seeing quantifiable shifts in those fast-growth pandemic-era boomtowns. For instance, you're seeing year-over-year price declines, or at least significant slowdowns, in markets that saw explosive growth, places like Florida, Texas, Austin areas where prices just soared, 40% or more in just a couple of years. Inventory is rising sharply in some places, sometimes doubling compared to pandemic lows, and days on market are getting longer. Plus, affordability driven by high rates and those inflated prices is stretched to, the breaking point for many people.
Right. That economic pressure is the real-world manifestation of this symbolic reckoning we're talking about. With the three cycles converging, the 18-year economic cycle hitting its typical downturn window, the Jupiter-Saturn structural tension peaking in this square phase, and the lunar nodes demanding a Virgo-style audit, we seem to be entering a phase where reckoning meets rebalancing. The market is being pushed, it seems, to confront the reality that land and housing prices, especially in certain regions, might have disconnected from utility, from incomes, from structural affordability. This cycle convergence strongly points toward a correction phase that will likely force a return to more fundamental value.
It's a remarkable convergence, really. It suggests that when people track the roughly 18-year housing cycle, maybe they are inadvertently recognizing an ancient truth, that markets, perhaps like nature itself, move in these deep fundamental rhythms that dictate the seasons of expansion and contraction, speculation and audit.
And, this raises an important question for you, the listener, to consider. If these cycles are indeed marking the pulse of our collective economic life, does it mean that financial markets are maybe less about rational individual human decision-making and perhaps more about humanity collectively acting out a universal, predictable pulse, a pulse of expansion and contraction that governs all things, from economies right up to the cosmos itself? Definitely something to think about until the next deep dive.